Thank y'all for your patience. I shared questions with the senator before we sat down just to make sure I was keeping it between the lines, and the only feedback I got was a few less questions about Bama football. So I've pared that down to just one question. So I'd like to start here, which is quite some time ago, you got a resume on your desk with a dude's name on it that you probably couldn't pronounce, but probably most people in Birmingham.
I still can't pronounce it.
And still can't pronounce. That was, as a spoiler alert, that resume was mine. And you did something that I feel pretty certain most established white lawyers in Birmingham would not have done back then. And you took a chance on me and gave me a job to work with you. And it's one of the best experiences I've ever had. What made you to decide to do something that, in my view, most people would not have done back then?
You know, maybe it was your dapper dress. Maybe it's the fact that, you know, I practice in the Bible Belt and I needed somebody that reminded my clients of Jesus. I don't know. But in all candor, we, you know, like I try to do with most everything, I did my homework, and what I wanted was somebody who was going to work hard, and somebody who was going to be dedicated, and somebody that I could talk to explain my views of where we were and what we were doing on a particular case and how important it is. And that's you fit that bill. All the references, everybody that we talked to fit that bill. So, and it was. I knew it would be a challenge for me just to learn how to pronounce your name. So I will say it was a great decision, and the times that we practiced law together were very, very special, and we made a good team. We made a really good team in trying to do the best that we could for some clients that were often difficult to work with, and we certainly had difficult fact situations to deal with.
We did. I felt like we made a good team because Doug and I think very differently, and I would sometimes joke that the only thought we ever shared on a particular work day was, what is that guy wearing? Like, we both had that thought about each other.
Mine more than you, I'm confident.
So, well, I wanted to start there just because I think it's so important when you're starting out in your career to have somebody who influences you and helps you as you're trying to learn how to be a professional, how to be a lawyer. And you had an experience early in your career where you had the opportunity to work with Senator Heflin in Washington, D.C. And can you talk some about how that was both formative and informative for you as a young person?
Yeah, you know, Howell Heflin was actually a Chief Justice, which is ironic if you consider who my opponent was in 2017. But Heflin was an amazing man. He was a former president of the Alabama Trial Lawyers, a former president of the Alabama Bar, is a big man from Northwest Alabama, and a Chief Justice. He ran to modernize the Alabama court system, and he did that. We have a horrible constitution in the state of Alabama. It's a 1901 racist constitution. It's the longest state constitution in the country, but he carved out the judicial article out of that and modernized our system in Alabama, and won numerous awards for it, and then decided not to run. But he was so popular that he was looking to run for either governor or the Senate. Senator Sparkman retired from that, and I worked on his campaign. I was in law school, but I'd known him, known his son Tom, who was in school with me, and I took off one summer and worked on his campaign, and I learned so much from him about representation of people, treating all people fairly, treating all people with dignity and respect. And I was just lucky enough to get a job with him. My first year, went out, you know, I took the bar exam in July and moved to D.C. in August, and I had a one-year deal with Heflin. Heflin wanted a kind of a judicial clerkship, and I worked 1 year on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Senator Kennedy was the chairman. He was also running for president, made for some exciting times. Ted Kennedy could really pull together a staff, though. The deputy chief counsel on that committee was Ken Feinberg, who did all of the 9/11 Victims Fund and the BP oil spill. And the chief counsel on judiciary at that time was Stephen Breyer, who's now Justice Stephen Breyer. So it was an incredible experience. But what I really saw with Heflin helped a lot, because he reached out to the black community, both for votes, but also for his service and what he could do. He appointed the first two black federal judges in Alabama. That was in 1979 and 1980, and we didn't get another federal judge, a black federal judge, until Barack Obama was elected in 2008. So it shows you his leadership and his vision, and he was just an amazing man to work for.
Well, I want to talk a little more about sort of growing up in Alabama, and not just sort of at the start of your professional career, but just growing up in Fairfield, Alabama, which I know was important to you then and is important to you now. And one of my favorite moments from when we worked together, and I think we were maybe coming back from court in Tuscaloosa, and we detoured through Fairfield, and you rode around and showed me some of your old haunts. I'm sure not all of them, but talk about just describe growing up in Fairfield and carrying those values you learned there to the Senate floor.
Fairfield was a little bedrock community outside of Birmingham. It was where United States Steel had their second largest steelmaking facility. There were 25,000 people that worked there at one point when I was a kid. It's now a shell with less than 1,000 people, but it was a new community. It was just, for a kid growing up, there were kids everywhere. We had a great time. But at the same time, it was a very segregated community. I was born in 1954, so I was transitioning in life as all the civil rights movement was also transitioning. Brown versus Board of Education is, I'm 2 weeks older than the Brown decision. And so we kind of grew this together. And when I started out in Fairfield, it was a very segregated community in my little neighborhood where I went to elementary school. But then in junior high, high school were integrated schools, and you learned to do things and how people that were not like you, they were different than you were, and people that you had not had a chance to be around. And it was a really incredible growth experience. And while there was so much happening in Birmingham, I was kind of shielded from that a little bit. But it let me be on my own in high school and others, and to make my friends, to do those kind of things that I think just led me into getting active at the University of Alabama, and then later on again with Senator Heflin and the political stuff. But we had a family meant a lot, as well as community meant a lot. And it was one of those things where I think you start to see a bigger picture, and that was the one great thing that my parents did. They didn't try to force anything. They just simply said, "You're a smart guy. Be who you are, and spread your wings, and you'll do well."
I want to talk a little more about Roy Moore later in this conversation, but while we're talking about your childhood, how old were you when you last wore a cowboy hat and carried a cap pistol?
I was
going to project an image of Roy Moore doing that on the screen, but I want to scare people over lunch.
It's been a while.
I thought it probably had.
It's been a while.
I thought it probably had.
And it's been a while since I've wore socks like this, too, I got to tell you.
I'm just glad to know you wore Julio Jones socks at any point in your career. And which is a great segue to Bama football, which is the part you said don't spend too much time on, and I'll try not to, but I just feel like it's a dereliction of duty if you're a Bama fan and you don't talk about it. But apart from just casual football chat, you're the senator from the state of Alabama now. Coach Saban actually was in a TV commercial endorsing
Joe Manchin,
his childhood friend in West Virginia. And do you, when he coaches young people, he talks about having a process and process-oriented thinking. And is that something that you try to do as you're campaigning? Do you sort of subscribe to process-oriented thinking, and do you get to hang out with Coach Saban?
I don't get to hang out with Nick. Nick doesn't hang out with too many folks. But look, I think to be where I am, you had to have a similar mindset. In our campaign, especially in 2017, we knew we wanted to focus on issues that people we felt like had in common throughout the state. We hear so much about the divisions that people have. We hear so much about the social divisions, the religious divisions, you name it. But we wanted to focus our campaign on the issues that we have in common, like healthcare, education, workforce development, all of those things that people talk about at their kitchen tables. And that's kind of the thing we adopted. And we knew that we had to stay focused. I was going to get diverted on any number of issues. And we made a point of trying to be disciplined enough to pivot back to the things that we felt like mattered most. And that's how we really focused all our media strategy, our social media strategy. I will tell you that in 2017, in November, when those allegations against Moore surfaced, it became a lot more difficult because everybody else and their brother wanted to talk about those allegations, and we wanted to stay focused. And so sticking to that process, I think Coach Saban does say, you know, stick to the process. Things are going to go wrong. You're going to get diverted. There'll be a fumble. You'll get intercepted, but you stick to the process. We did that, and we've done that in the Senate. I think I could have gone into the Senate and been on MSNBC or CNN every night for 6 months, and instead we got to working on those things. And that's what we've stuck with. I'm on banking, I'm on health, I'm on armed services now, and we have really put a process in place where we are either getting something done or we're beginning a process that's going to get things done for people in Alabama.
When you talk about the level of focus that's required to be in the Senate, are there moments when you find yourself, whether it's at a fundraiser or just out in the world, where people treat you like a celebrity, or you encounter a celebrity and you think to yourself, I can't believe I'm talking to this person? How does that work kind of both ways?
Well, you know, we got a lot of publicity, so I get recognized a lot, and there's a lot, and that's very humbling for people to and you saw some of that even after the church bombing cases, you know, locally, but to go around and people, and I'll tell you a couple of things. The thing that I heard most, and I don't think we fully appreciated it in the campaign because we did stay so focused on the race and our issues, was how much the race meant to so many people. I mean, I hear so many times that the race and the outcome of the race gave people hope, not just in Alabama and in the South, but across the country, and that's very gratifying. You know, I meet a lot of people. I have a lot of fun. I had lunch with Smokey Robinson. I've done a lot of things, but I will tell you that to me, being someone that's been engaged in politics for a long time, kind of a history buff myself, the thing that to me is just the best is that when we have votes on the Senate floor, you know, the Senate is not the great deliberative body that it used to be. Some of us are calling it a legislative graveyard right now, but that's a different story. But it's not that you don't see the great debates, and we go on the floor and we vote, and those votes last for 15 to 30 minutes, and that's a real opportunity to talk to the other senators because we just don't have that as much. But what I like to do is I like to just go sit at my desk on the floor of the United States Senate and just look around and just understand where I am and what I'm doing, knowing it's only one of 100. There's been less than 2,000 senators in the history of the United States. And ever so often I'll open the drawer, the middle drawer, to see the names of where the people that have used that desk have scrawled their handwriting on there, and it's people like John Kennedy and Harry Truman and Ed Muskie and all this, and you just feel the history, and that is by far the coolest thing about this. It's just a sense of wonder almost.
You mentioned folks maybe thinking of what goes on in Congress as being a legislative graveyard, and I want to talk for a moment about sort of our current political climate and how it's evolving, and there seem to be competing schools of thought about whether we need more ruthlessness in politics or whether we need more love. And from some conversations we've had, I think your approach is the same as Dr. King's, and it's a comment he made, I think, here in Atlanta when he was addressing this SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, way back, I think, in 1967. And he said, I've decided to stick with love. And is that your approach? And if so, why does love conquer hate?
Well, I think, you know, look, politics has been ugly. Everybody talks about the fact that we're in a really divisive time, and we are. It's very tribal. But if you go back and you look at history, ever since we started having elections, it's been pretty ugly. But the fact is, people try to get things done. And I think there is always going to be an edge to politics. There's always going to be an edge to your political campaigning, whether it is Twitter or whether it's social media or whether it's your TV ads. But there's a difference, I think, in having an edge to you and really poking somebody a little bit, as opposed to trying to demean people, calling them names, and those kind of things. I really think that we're getting at a point that we need to dial that back. I would encourage folks, anybody that's interested in community service and interested in the political process, I would encourage you to read a book by Arthur Brooks, who's head of the American Enterprise Institute, very conservative think tank in Washington, and I've talked to Arthur about this. He's got a book out called Love Your Enemies. And he talks about the fact there's like, I forget, it's like 6 in 10 or 1 in 6 or something. It's an extraordinary number of people who no longer will talk to a family member or a close friend because of politics after 2016. We've got to change that, and the only way you can change that is just to dial it back a little bit, have a little more civility, have a little more respect. Don't lose your edge. Don't lose an edge in politics. You can always have an edge. But let's dial it back, because you've got to be able to work with folks. You've got to be able to, I'm in a unique position because people always talk about me reaching across the aisle. But there's a lot of times I have to reach on my own side of the table and pull people into a position where we can get some things done.
You mentioned opportunities to serve and if people have interest in service. And before you were a U.S. Senator, you've had some other opportunities to serve. You were United States Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama. You prosecuted 2 cold cases to bring church bombers to justice who killed Denise McNair, Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Morris Wesley, as well as starting the investigation into Eric Rudolph that ultimately led to bringing him to justice, who bombed Olympic Park here in Atlanta and the all-women's clinic in Birmingham. And those are big cases. Yeah. And how do you, when you find yourself in something that the whole world is watching, which I think is how Carolyn McKinstry titled her book about bombing, how do you handle that emotionally and handle that pressure?
Well, handling the church bombing case emotionally was a lot different than handling the Rudolph case, because in the church bombing, that had such an emotional impact. Everywhere you go, everyone you talk to, the families, church members, the community at large, it had such a really deep emotional impact. The clinic bombing was a lot different. I'd only been U.S. Attorney a few months when that happened. I got there right after the bomb exploded. They had just removed the nurse. The body of the police officer was still there. And you have to, at that point, detach yourself so that you can focus on the job at hand. And even in the church bombing investigation, I had known the McNair family for many, many years. Chris and Maxine had been friends for a long, long time. Had known the pastor. I'd known a number of other people. Bill Baxley, who had prosecuted the case, the first one of the cases in 1977, and I were very close. But I made a point of not trying to get too engaged with the family members too early, because I didn't know when we started that case whether or not we could actually prosecute the case or not. I didn't know if we would get an indictment, much less be successful, or that I would have to have a press conference and announce that we just couldn't make the case. And I didn't want to lose the objectivity I think a prosecutor needs to have in order to determine whether or not you feel like there's enough evidence to bring the case beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, once we got into those trials, especially the church bombing case, because Rudolph we didn't catch for 5 years and I'd left office, but once we got into it, it was an emotional roller coaster on those cases with the church bombing case. And it's still an emotional roller coaster. The book that I wrote, everything else, every time I give a speech, every time I talk, every time I invoke the name of those children, it brings it all back home.
Well, funny you should mention your book. I, talk show style, tried to deftly hide a copy back here, bending toward justice. And I think we're near the end of the time for our conversation, so it's maybe a good segue if we have time for a question or two. Angela has a mic. Feel free to ask Doug about his book or anything else.
Raise your hand and we'll come to you.
And while someone is getting the nerve to ask a sitting senator a question.
I've obviously overwhelmed the crowd with, or either they're just hungry.
All right. Probably both.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned about working with people across the aisle. I was curious, who in the Republican Party have you been working with to find common ground, and who have you developed a relationship with?
It's a good question. Obviously, the number one person that I work with is my senior colleague from Alabama, Richard Shelby. Richard's chairman of appropriations. We've been friends for a very long time. He and his staff have been very, very good to us. And we just got back from the air show in Paris together with a couple of other senators. So he's the number one. But there's several others, some of which are surprising, some not so much. For instance, Lamar Alexander is the chairman of the Health, Education, Labor, Pensions Committee. Lamar and I talk a lot, and we've got some things pending right now. We're waiting to see how things go before we actually file some bills. He has been very, very good. I worked with Senator Perdue and Senator Isaacson from here in Georgia on the disaster relief bill. They were really great to work with. I think Johnny Isaacson in particular is just one of my favorite people in the Senate. But then there are folks that we find some common ground with on the banking committee that politically we don't always get along. And, you know, Senator Cotton, Tom Cotton from Arkansas, is one. He and I are about as far apart as you can get on most things politically, but we found just enough things in the banking space to work together. We filed a big bill involving money laundering, updating the money laundering laws. This 2 weeks ago, we filed that along with Senator Warner and Senator Rounds. Tim Scott from South Carolina and I've also done some things on the committee. I'll tell you the one, though, that is going to probably surprise folks the most. Obviously, given my interest in cold civil rights cases, I filed a bill last year called the Civil Rights Cold Case Collection Act. And it was based on what some high school kids had called and talked to me about, you know, at least 2 years before I got elected, because they'd been frustrated trying to get some records through FOIA on a cold civil rights case from the 1960s. And so they had this idea for a bill that would create a commission like the Kennedy Assassination Commission to gather the records, have a commission look at them, and then make them public. I told them I'd absolutely endorse the bill. Well, those kids called me back after I got elected. And they said, remember us? I said, absolutely. Well, we filed that bill, and it was a great bill, and we filed that bill, and those kids were coming down, and I didn't have a Republican co-sponsor. So many of the bills have really bipartisan support that get filed. I didn't have a Republican co-sponsor, but I wanted to go ahead and give my floor speech and let those kids talk about, see the floor speech and know their work is coming to fruition. The person sitting in the presiding chamber, if you ever watch C-SPAN and you see the speeches, know that there's not anybody on the floor. There is nobody listening except visitors up in the gallery. And the presiding officer is usually doing their own work and not paying attention to anything except points of order. Well, Ted Cruz was sitting up there. And I noticed that after about 30 seconds into my speech, Ted stopped, turned around, and listened to every word of my speech. Came up to me later and said, Doug, I think that's a great bill. I'm really interested. I think we can get it passed. He became the lead co-sponsor with me. We got it passed by unanimous consent in the Senate. He helped it get to the floor of the House, working with Paul Ryan. The President of the United States signed it in January of this year. And because of that, this year we did something I think fairly extraordinary. Every year in February, there is a senator who is assigned to read George Washington's farewell address. It's really a remarkable document that I would encourage you to read. Well, this year we decided to take things one step further. And in April, which coincides with the children's marches in Birmingham, I had 6 senators read Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. Another thing that I think you all ought to read. I mean, it is as timely today as it was in 1963. And so I had 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. I got myself, Kamala Harris, and Tim Kaine to read for the Democrats. I had Lamar Alexander, Lisa Murkowski, and Ted Cruz reading that. So, you know, you find some strange bedfellows wherever you can, but you get things done. So that's just but a few. But I do a lot. I try to do as much as I can, talking to as many of my Republican colleagues as possible, knowing that they're going to come after me in 2020.
I don't know if we have time for one more, if we're out of time. Angela, are we out of time, or we got time for one more?
One short one.
Okay, all right, one more question.
I'm a short senator, so I can do that.
Looks like Sanjay has her hand up. Or
We got one right over here.
Okay, you got it?
Senator, as you know, you're running for re-election next year.
Where are we here?
Over here.
Okay.
In a presidential election year, and no matter who the Democratic nominee is likely not going to be too popular in your home state. How do you plan on running for re-election and striking a balance between embracing the core values of your party as well as understanding that whoever the nominee is not going to be very popular in your state?
Yeah, you know, look, it's a good question, but the Democratic Party has a basic core value, but at the same time, we also have a lot of different views. It's a really big tent. I don't really have a real problem doing that because, you know, people ask me all the time, are you an Alabama Democrat? Are you a conservative Democrat? Are you a progressive Democrat? Are you a liberal Democrat? I just tell them I'm a Doug Democrat because I just try to do what I think is the right, and I diverge from my party a good bit, and they understand that. But you know, it's not like some of the old days. I'm still a Democrat at heart because Democrats believe in the fundamental goodness of people. We believe that people ought to have a fair shake. We believe that people ought to have the same rights to work and that the other person has that doesn't look like them or practice the same religion as them. So we've got those beliefs about what we do and where we are. And how we get there sometimes will be the divergence. But, you know, what I found in my race in Alabama, and I really believe this, and it's not trite, and I don't really balance anything. I don't navigate anything. I don't balance anything. You know, it's kind of liberating when you're on one side and you vote one way and people say, oh, he's just voting that way to get reelected, and you vote another way and they say, oh, he's just a puppet of somebody. So that's pretty liberating. You can do what the hell you want to do. And that's what we do. I told my staff early on, I said, I want you to give me every information we can on every single issue. We'll debate these issues on the tough ones. Some of them are easy, some are not so easy. But the one thing I do not want to hear from you is I don't want to hear anybody tell me that politically you should do X. I said, that is just not going to be in our vocabulary. So I think people in today's world especially, even though it's a very tribal country, it's a very tribal state in Alabama, I still think people are looking for authenticity. I think people want to look you in the eye and have a discussion with them, have a dialogue, and they know you're listening to them, and you take their views into consideration. You might not always agree, but you're still going to find common ground on a lot of things. And I think that's the key now, is finding as much common ground as we can on as many issues as we can, and agree to disagree without being disagreeable when we can. And that's the way I think we need to move forward, not just in Alabama. It's not just the way I'm going to get reelected. It's the way I think we need to move forward as a country. So thank you for that.
Cool. Thank you for being generous with your time today, Senator, and making the trip here. I'd like to give two quick shout-outs to two people that, in my view, made this happen. This was Angela Singh's idea, and she was patient to kind of let it develop, and she's owed a debt of thanks, and didn't freak out when both the senator and I were cutting it close on time. And the senator's campaign staff, Samantha Thurber, also helped put this together, and is so clutch that when I said, do you have a hair tie I can borrow, she in fact did. So that way I was able to eat my salad free from interference.
Yeah, but you didn't get the Jesus look.
I didn't.
That's the only thing.
I spoiled that joke. So I don't know if I'm allowed to say that I'm hosting a reception for Doug. And I'm not allowed to say it, so I won't say that. Yes, so I won't say that. Thank you for everyone's time. Senator, we hope you come back and visit us again. I feel like we didn't have enough time. We greatly appreciate you being here and supporting our Bar Association, and we appreciate all your work.
My pleasure. Thank you, guys. Thanks so much.